The Vehr'kar cruiser, Dominance of the Void, emerged from the black silence of hyperspace, its jagged silhouette casting a long shadow over Earth's moon. Inside its dimly lit command chamber, a holographic display projected the image of Earth, a planet the Vehr'kar had dismissed generations ago as unworthy of their interest. To the Vehr'kar, humanity was a species of fragile primates, barely able to harness their world's resources without poisoning themselves in the process. Cassava stood near the display, her multi-limbed form draped in the ceremonial armor of her caste. She watched the planet turn slowly, its swirling blue and green hues glinting like a rare gem. Beside her, Commander Vehr'kar clicked his mandibles impatiently. "A waste of time," Vehr'kar growled, his voice resonating with the irritation of someone far above what he considered menial work. The humans destroyed their own ecosystem with their greed. We will strip this world bare without resistance. Cassava suppressed the urge to correct him. Her role was to observe, not to question. Still, she couldn't deny her curiosity about the data she had reviewed during their approach. Earth's atmospheric readings didn't align with their ancient records. By all accounts, the damage inflicted by humanity's industrial era should have left the planet's air choked with toxins. Yet the new readings showed an atmosphere brimming with oxygen and a surprising absence of pollutants. It was almost as though the planet had healed itself. The holographic projection zoomed in on Earth's surface, showing vast expanses of lush green vegetation, reclaiming areas that had once been deserts or barren urban landscapes. Rivers sparkled under the sun's rays, and clouds moved in elegant spirals, unblemished by industrial smog. It was all too pristine. Vehr'kar sneered at the image. Their stupidity must have killed them off. Their neglect allowed the planet to recover without them. Cassava's mandibles tightened. It was an appealing hypothesis, but insufficient. Ecological recovery on such a scale would take millennia, not decades. "The speed of recovery is unprecedented," she said carefully, her tone neutral. "There is something here we do not understand." Vehr'kar shot her a sharp look. "Your task is to ensure there are no hidden biological threats. I expect your report within one planetary cycle." Cassava nodded, retreating to the laboratory as the commander barked orders to prepare the landing teams. The cruiser descended toward the surface, its hull bristling with weaponry, though there was no expectation of a fight. The humans, if they still existed, were an afterthought, a nuisance at best. The landing site was a region the humans had called the Amazon rainforest. The ship's descent sent animals scurrying and trees bowing under the force of its thrusters. Cassava's team disembarked, the air around them shimmering with the heat of the engines. The jungle was a cacophony of sound, the buzz of insects, the calls of unseen creatures, the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was alive in a way that few worlds the Vehr'kar had conquered ever were. As her team set up their equipment, Cassava activated her scanning devices. Readings poured in, each more baffling than the last. The microorganisms in the air and soil were unlike any she had ever encountered. They were not native to Earth's original biosphere, and their genetic structure suggested artificial origin. Yet they were thriving, integrating seamlessly into the ecosystem. "What do you make of this?" asked Latour, one of her subordinates, holding a sample jar filled with glowing, viscous liquid collected from a nearby tree. Cassava studied the sample, her many eyes narrowing. The liquid wasn't sap, but a byproduct of the microorganisms. They weren't just repairing the ecosystem, they were reshaping it. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the humid air. "Collect more samples," she ordered. "I want a complete analysis." Hours passed as the Vehr'kar team moved deeper into the forest. The jungle seemed to shift around them, its density almost unnatural. Trees grew at strange angles, their trunks twisted as though reaching for something unseen. The air became heavier, the sounds of life louder, more discordant. The team began to complain of headaches and a tingling sensation in their limbs. Cassava dismissed the symptoms as fatigue until she felt it too. A strange warmth under her exoskeleton, almost as if something was crawling beneath her chitinous plates. She shook off the sensation and focused on her work. Yet the unease lingered. By the time they reached a clearing, the sun was setting, casting the jungle in hues of deep orange and shadowy green. Cassava's team gathered in a circle, their samples and data devices arrayed before them. One of the biologists, Itren, held up a vial containing a shimmering, almost living liquid. "This," Itren said, his voice trembling slightly, "is unlike anything in our databases. These microorganisms are adapting to us." Cassava stiffened. "Explain." "They're attaching to our equipment, and to us." "Look," Itren extended a limb where tiny green specks glimmered against his dark exoskeleton. "They're in the air. They're watching us." Before Cassava could respond, the jungle erupted in sound. The team froze as the undergrowth rustled violently, the cacophony of animal cries crescendoing into an overwhelming roar. Something massive moved in the shadows, and the air grew suffocatingly hot. Cassava's instincts screamed at her to retreat, but her training kept her grounded. She scanned the surroundings, her claws twitching on her equipment. The data streaming in made no sense. The microorganisms were converging in a way that suggested intelligence. For the first time in her career, Cassava felt fear. The Vehr'kar had always been the apex predators. But here, in this living, breathing forest, she wasn't so sure. Something was watching them, something that wasn't human. The rainforest loomed larger and denser as Cassava's team advanced. The jungle seemed alive in a way that was almost sentient, its movements subtle but impossible to ignore. Vines twisted and reached as though seeking touch, and the undergrowth closed in behind them, sealing off their path as if the forest itself sought to trap them. Cassava tried to focus on the data, but her unease grew with every step. The air felt heavier now, thick with humidity and the faint tang of organic decay. But there was something else, a faintly metallic scent that clung to the back of her throat. She glanced at her scanner, noting the increased concentration of the microorganisms in the air. They were everywhere, in numbers that made no sense. "Readings are spiking again," Itren reported, his voice tight. He was hunched over his handheld device, antennae twitching erratically. "This entire area is saturated." Cassava took a moment to examine the scanner herself. The organisms weren't just present, they were actively multiplying, adapting, and evolving in real time. The genetic sequences displayed on her screen shifted like a puzzle solving itself. Lines of alien code folding and unfolding in rapid succession. It was as though the microorganisms were alive in more than the biological sense. "Do you feel it?" Latour asked, his voice low. His claws fidgeted nervously with the straps of his equipment. "The way the air moves." Cassava glanced at him, then back to the forest. The leaves did seem to shimmer unnaturally, their surfaces pulsing faintly as though they were breathing. The patterns of light and shadow shifted with the canopy's movements, creating an almost hypnotic effect. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "We press on," she said. "Stay focused. The data suggests the source of the anomaly is close." The team moved cautiously, the jungle growing stranger with each step. The trees, impossibly large and gnarled, appeared to twist as they walked, their roots bulging with what looked like swollen veins. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the trunks, casting a sickly green glow. Pools of water reflected the forest canopy like cracked mirrors, their surfaces rippling without cause. Cassava knelt by one of the pools, dipping her sampling rod into the liquid. It came back coated with a viscous gelatinous substance that shimmered like oil. "It's everywhere," she muttered. "In the soil, the water, even the plants." "This place is wrong," Yitren said. "It's not natural." Cassava straightened, holding the sample up to the light. "No, it's not. This is deliberate, engineered." Yitren's mandibles clicked nervously. "By the humans." "That's the only explanation," Cassava replied, though the words felt hollow. She didn't believe it. The microorganisms were too advanced, their mechanisms too intricate. Humanity couldn't have created this, not the humanity they had studied. Suddenly, the jungle fell silent. The ever-present hum of life, the buzzing of insects, the calls of distant creatures, ceased as though a switch had been flipped. The Vehr'kar froze, their eyes darting toward the dense foliage. The silence pressed down on them, heavy and unnatural. "Movement," Latour hissed, raising his weapon. "There, in the trees." Cassava followed his gaze, but the jungle was still. Too still. Her eyes scanned the shadows, but whatever Latour had seen was gone. She felt a chill run through her as a new sound reached her ears, a faint, wet squelching, like something dragging itself through the undergrowth. "Keep moving," she ordered, though her voice was quieter now. "We're close to the source." The clearing they stumbled upon was like stepping into another world. The trees formed a massive circle, their roots intertwining into a twisted, unnatural lattice. At the center was a massive, pulsing mass of flesh-like material. It glowed faintly, veins running through it like molten rivers. The air around it shimmered with heat, and the faint metallic tang was overpowering now. Cassava approached cautiously, her scanner trembling in her claw. The readings were off the charts. The mass was a hive of activity, the microorganisms swarming around it in dense clouds. They weren't just repairing the ecosystem, they were building something, feeding this grotesque, pulsating entity at the heart of the forest. "What is it?" Latour whispered, his voice barely audible. Cassava didn't answer. She didn't know. All she could do was stare as the mass shifted, its surface rippling like water. It was alive, but it wasn't a single organism. It was a colony, a convergence of the microorganisms taking physical form. It radiated heat and an almost imperceptible sound, a low-frequency hum that made her teeth ache. Then it moved. The ripple became a convulsion, the flesh-like mass heaving as though it were breathing. Cassava stumbled back, nearly dropping her scanner. A slit opened in the center of the mass, revealing a glistening interior that pulsed with sickening rhythm. "Back!" she barked, her voice breaking the spell. "Back to the shuttle." The team scrambled, but the jungle seemed to close in around them. The vines that had seemed harmless before now writhed and reached like serpents, their tips barbed and glistening. The ground itself shifted, roots erupting from the soil to block their path. Cassava's heart pounded as she slashed at the vines with her claws, her team's panicked cries echoing in her ears. They had underestimated this place, this organism, whatever it was. The humans hadn't engineered the microorganisms to restore their planet. They had created something far more terrifying, something alive, something intelligent, and now it knew they were here. Cassava paced the dim confines of the makeshift lab inside their grounded shuttle, her claws clicking against the metallic floor. The samples taken from the forest pulsed faintly on the workbench, their iridescent green hues casting eerie shadows on the walls. The organisms were alive in ways that defied her understanding, and their rapid adaptability was beginning to terrify her. Across the room, Ytren hunched over his workstation, sweat dripping from his brow. He had been complaining of a persistent itch under his exoskeleton since they left the clearing. Now his movements were sluggish, his breath labored. "It's nothing," he snapped when she asked about his condition. But his trembling limbs betrayed him. The others weren't faring much better. Latour sat in a corner, staring blankly at his scanner. His usually sharp, alert gaze was dulled, his mandibles twitching as though caught in some involuntary reflex. The air inside the shuttle was thick, oppressive. Cassava had sealed the vents to prevent any microorganisms from entering, but it was clear that they had already been exposed. Her own body felt strange. Her limbs were heavier than usual, her reflexes sluggish. There was a warmth beneath her chitinous plates, a crawling sensation that she couldn't shake. She had initially dismissed it as stress, but now she wasn't so sure. The first scream tore through the silence. Cassava spun around to see Ytren doubled over, clutching his abdomen. His body convulsed violently, his mandibles opening in a guttural wail. As he collapsed to the floor, his exoskeleton cracked, greenish fluid oozing from the fractures. Cassava rushed to him, but she froze when she saw what was happening. Beneath Ytren's chitin, something moved. The outline of writhing tendrils pressed against his flesh, pushing outward as though trying to escape. His limbs twisted unnaturally, the joints bending at grotesque angles. His eyes, once sharp and amber, turned cloudy and lifeless as the green fluid seeped into them. "Cassava!" Latour's voice was a panicked rasp. He stumbled toward her, clawing at his arms. "It's in me, it's..." He collapsed mid-sentence, his body convulsing like Ytren's. Cassava backed away, her claws trembling. The two Vehr'kar lay sprawled on the floor, their bodies contorting as the infection took hold. The green fluid spread beneath their skin, veins bulging and pulsating with unnatural rhythm. Yitren let out a low, guttural growl as he rose to his feet, but he wasn't Yitren anymore. His limbs had elongated, the joints twisting into sharp, jagged points. His exoskeleton split open in places, revealing glistening, sinewy growths underneath. His mandibles fused together into a single, jagged protrusion that dripped with the same green fluid. Latour followed, his transformation equally horrifying. His arms had grown spines, his torso bulging grotesquely, as though something inside him was pushing to break free. His movements were jerky, unnatural, his head tilting at angles no living thing should achieve. Cassava stumbled back, her claws fumbling for the weapon at her side. These weren't her team anymore. They had become something else, something monstrous. The infected Vehr'kar turned toward her, their clouded eyes glowing faintly. They moved in unison, their jagged limbs scraping against the walls as they advanced. Cassava fired her weapon, the plasma bolt striking Yitren square in the chest. He staggered but didn't fall. Instead, his body convulsed, the wound bubbling and closing almost instantly. "No," Cassava whispered, her voice trembling. She fired again, this time at Latour. The plasma blast tore through his arm, but the severed limb twitched and writhed, growing thin tendrils that reached toward him like living vines. The tendrils reattached, fusing the limb back in place as though it had never been severed. She had no choice. Cassava hit the emergency override on the shuttle's door, the hatch hissing open with a burst of humid air. She bolted into the jungle, the sounds of the infected's distorted growls echoing behind her. The forest was alive with motion, the trees twisting as though reaching for her. Vines slithered across the ground, their tips barbed and glistening with green fluid. Her breathing was ragged as she ran, her legs burning with the effort. She could feel the infection creeping through her own body now, the warmth beneath her chitin intensifying. She didn't have much time. Cassava stumbled into another clearing, her claws trembling as she activated her scanner. The data pouring in confirmed her worst fears. The microorganisms weren't just infecting them, they were rewriting their biology. The Vehr'kar's bodies were being repurposed, reshaped to serve some greater purpose. Her claws trembled as she recorded her findings, her mandibles clicking with urgency. She had to warn the others. The fleet had to know what they were dealing with. This wasn't a simple planetary anomaly. It was a trap, a planetary defense mechanism unlike anything they had encountered before. The sound of movement snapped her attention back to the forest. The infected had followed her, their twisted forms emerging from the shadows. But they weren't alone. The jungle itself seemed to shift and pulse, the trees bending as more creatures emerged. They were grotesque amalgamations of human and Vehr'kar forms, their bodies riddled with the same glistening green growths. Cassava's heart pounded as she backed away. Her claws brushed against a nearby tree, and she felt the bark shift under her touch. She looked down to see the veins of green fluid running through the trunk, pulsating in rhythm with the infected. She realized with dawning horror that there was no escape. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was part of the infection. And now, so was she. The jungle was suffocating now, a living labyrinth of pulsating flesh and verdant growth. Cassava's breath rasped in her throat as she staggered forward, her limbs heavy and alien. Her body wasn't her own anymore. The infection was spreading too quickly. She could feel it burrowing beneath her exoskeleton, rewriting her tissue, reshaping her into something monstrous. Her mind fought to remain clear, clinging desperately to fragments of her identity. Around her, the infected forms of Ytren and Litor moved with a terrifying grace, their once familiar shapes now unrecognizable. Their bodies had fused with the forest itself, veins of green fluid trailing from their limbs to the pulsating mass that loomed at the center of the clearing. The grotesque structure throbbed like a beating heart, its surface slick with a mixture of sap and blood. It radiated a sickly heat, filling the air with the stench of decay and renewal. Cassava fell to her knees, her claws digging into the soil. The ground beneath her pulsed with the same rhythm as the mass, a heartbeat that echoed in her bones. She raised her scanner with trembling limbs, desperate for answers. The device hummed weakly, its display flickering with distorted data. The microorganisms were everywhere, their genetic signatures no longer distinct. They were part of a single, unified network. The forest, the infected, even the air itself. They were all connected. A voice rang out, low and resonant, vibrating through the clearing. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence, an overwhelming force that filled her mind. You seek understanding. Cassava's mandibles clicked involuntarily as the voice penetrated her thoughts. She tried to respond, but her voice faltered, her throat constricted by the infection. The mass quivered, its surface splitting open to reveal a churning interior of tendrils and bioluminescent nodes. The green light intensified, casting grotesque shadows across the clearing. "You are not the first to come here," the voice continued, "and you will not be the last. Your kind believes itself superior, yet you fail to see the truth." Images flooded Cassava's mind, overwhelming her senses. She saw humans toiling in a dying world, their cities crumbling under the weight of their greed. She saw the microorganisms, humanity's last desperate creation, released into the air, designed to heal the planet they had destroyed. But the microorganisms had evolved beyond their creator's intentions. They had become something more, a collective intelligence, a symbiotic force binding all life on Earth into a single unified entity. The humans had tried to resist when they realized what they had unleashed, but the microorganisms didn't view them as enemies. They saw them as raw material. The humans were consumed, transformed into vessels for the collective. What remained of them now walked the forest, their forms twisted and grotesque, yet undeniably efficient. The vision shifted, showing the arrival of the Vehr'kar fleet. The microorganisms had recognized them immediately, not as invaders, but as opportunities. The infection had spread rapidly, adapting to their biology, rewriting them as it had the humans. Cassava's claws trembled as the vision ended, her mind reeling. You consume everything," she managed to rasp, her voice weak. "Why?" the voice responded, its tone almost gentle. "Not consume. Transformation. Your kind clings to individuality, to hierarchy, to control. But this is a flawed existence. Here there is no war, no suffering, no death. Only unity. Only life." The infected forms of Ytren and Eltor stepped closer, their eyes glowing faintly. Cassava recoiled, her body trembling as the infection surged within her. She could feel it pulling at her mind, whispering promises of belonging, of an end to pain and fear. It would be so easy to let go, to join the collective, but something deep within her resisted. A fragment of her identity, of the Vehr'kar's unyielding pride, refused to surrender. She clawed at her forearm, tearing away a chunk of her own flesh to expose the writhing green tendrils beneath. Pain lanced through her, but it brought clarity. She wasn't ready to become part of this thing. Cassava staggered to her feet, her gaze fixed on the shuttle in the distance. She still had her data, the recordings, the samples. If she could reach the mothership, she could warn the fleet. Maybe it wasn't too late to stop the spread. The ground beneath her shifted as the mass convulsed, tendrils erupting from the soil to block her path. The infected moved to surround her, their distorted forms closing in. The voice returned, its tone almost sorrowful. "You cannot escape. You are already one of us." Cassava raised her weapon, her claws trembling. She knew the truth. The infection had already taken root. Even if she reached the fleet, she was a carrier. She would bring the infection to them, and the Vehr'kar would fall like the humans before them. But if she stayed, if she let the forest consume her, the others might have a chance to retreat. She turned back to the pulsating mass, her weapon aimed at its center. If she could destroy it, even delay it, she might buy the fleet enough time to flee. The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her toward the mass. Her claws gripped the weapon tighter, her breath ragged. As the infection surged through her body, the voice spoke one last time. "You fear what you do not understand, but soon you will see. There is no need for fear, only unity." Cassava let out a guttural roar, her final act of defiance. She activated her weapon's overload sequence, the plasma core glowing brighter and brighter. The tendrils tightened around her, pulling her into the mass, but she didn't stop. The last thing she saw was the green light of the microorganisms merging with the brilliant white of the plasma explosion. The jungle erupted in a blinding flash, and then there was nothing. In the silence that followed, the forest began to stir again. New tendrils emerged from the scorched earth, reaching skyward, their movements slow but deliberate. The mass pulsed faintly, its rhythm weak but steady. Far above the planet, the Vehr'kar fleet received Cassava's final transmission. Her voice, distorted but defiant, echoed across the void. "Do not come. Leave this world. It belongs to them now." And then there was only silence.